Welcome, everyone. Thanks for trading part of your day for this event here. I'm excited you're here. I'm Ed Metcalf, joined by John Casal, one of our senior sales engineers, and the person who will actually really show you the goods a little later through a demo. So a quick promise here, there'll be no fear-mongering. No sky is falling theatrics. Here is one idea to hold on to. Endpoint controls fail. Not occasionally, but constantly. And what separates resilient organizations isn't stopping every failure, it's how fast they bounce back. Controls fail, resilience doesn't. So let's go ahead and dig in. Before we jump into the technology, here's where we're headed. We'll start by looking at why traditional approaches are falling behind and why the gap between discovering a vulnerability and exploiting it keeps getting smaller. Then we'll look at what independent analysts, including Gartner, are saying about the problem. Spoiler alert here, they're saying many of the same things we've been seeing from customers all along. And from there, we'll talk about why patching alone isn't enough and why prioritization has become just as important as remediation. Next, I'll show you how automation helps close the gap by focusing on the risks that actually matter to you as an organization, and then more importantly, verifying that those fixes are in fact successful. We'll also look at how the self-healing controls keep security protections working over time, which turns out to be a lot more useful than discovering they're broken during an audit, for example. Those are rarely anyone's favorite meetings for sure. And finally, we'll wrap it up with a live demonstration where John will show us how the products actually work to help stop some of these vulnerabilities and provide more cyber resilience. So let's go ahead and get started. First, let's start with the problem because it's a good one. For years, the industry's answer to vulnerability has been patch faster, right? Spoiler alert again, that hasn't worked, right? And it isn't going to. Exposure is growing faster than any team can patch. So this section is about naming the real problem, not to depress you, but so the rest of the session actually lands. What this slide really captures, though, is the challenges security teams are facing today. The reality is that security controls fail. Agents drift, get disabled, devices fall out of policy, systems don't always behave the way we'd like. That's not a rare event. It's part of managing thousands of endpoints in the real world, as I'm sure you're all aware of. The problem is that attackers aren't waiting around anymore. The use of AI has dramatically compressed that timeline. New vulnerabilities can be discovered, weaponized, and even exploited in hours, while many organizations are still measuring remediation in days or even weeks. So while our ability to detect threats has improved, our ability to respond hasn't really kept pace. And it's kind of like trying to catch a Formula One car on a bicycle. And that's why we say the window to act keeps getting smaller and smaller. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is about resilience, making sure you can restore, recover, and keep people productive before a security event turns into a real business outage. So if that's a problem, what's the answer? For years, the industry has told us the solution is simple. Patch faster. But patching faster by itself is not enough. We know that. That's like telling someone stuck in traffic to drive faster, right? That just doesn't work. The problem isn't your speed, it's everything around you. Attackers are operating at machine speed, and most organizations simply can't come up with a manual process. And at the same time, security teams are buried in alerts, making it difficult to know which issues actually deserve the immediate attention. And even after a fix is deployed, there's often a big unanswered question. Did it actually work? Too many organizations assume the job is done without even verifying it. It is actually done and what that outcome really is. That's where we believe the industry needs to shift. Instead of trying to do everything faster, focus on what matters the most. Prioritize risks that are actually exploitable, automate remediation wherever you can, and verify that the fix actually worked. Making sure those security controls are also alive and operating well is very important over time as well. So closing that remediation gap isn't about working harder, it's about working smarter with automation, validation, and resilience built into the overall process. So some of you may be thinking, of course, the security vendor is going to tell me to patch faster, and that is hard to do. Well, that's fair, right? So instead of taking our word for it, let's look at what Gartner is saying. Their conclusion is pretty direct. No one is outpacing threat actors at scale, right? And the data explains why. Only about 10% of disclosed vulnerabilities are actually exploited. Yet most organizations spend enormous amount of time chasing sheer volume instead of focusing on the small number of vulnerabilities that truly matter. Now, on the flip side, roughly 12% of vulnerabilities never receive a patch at all. And if you're waiting for every patch to arrive before you're protected, you're going to be waiting for a long time. Then there's the reality of the operational environment itself. Our own resilience risk index shows that endpoint security controls silently fail about 20% of the time, silently. Even if you're successfully deployed a control in place, there's no guarantee that it's going to be working tomorrow. And then finally, Gartner points out that a bad patch can create as much as 100 hours of downtime, which reminds us that patching itself, it introduces operational risk. So when you step back, the message becomes pretty clear. There isn't a patch management problem. There's an exposure management problem. And the goal is to patch everything. And it isn't to patch everything. The goal is to continuously identify what is actually exploitable. You need to verify your controls are functioning and reduce the overall business exposure that truly matters. That's the shift from traditional vulnerability management to cyber resilience. So, okay, enough doom. Take a deep breath. The good news is there's a clear way through, and it isn't to hire more people to patch faster. The fix has three really big moves: prioritize what actually matters, automate the remediation, and the part everyone really forgets is making sure to verify that it actually works. So let's walk through each one in a little bit more detail. This is where we need to rethink how we prioritize risk. Most organizations are overwhelmed by the sheer number of vulnerabilities. Thousands of new CVEs are published every year. But the reality is that only a small percentage are ever exploited. For example, this month's Patch Tuesday saw the most CVEs that has ever been produced. About 578 are being announced in this month's Patch Tuesday, far and above anything that they've had before. Severity scores can help, but they don't tell the whole story. In fact, we've seen plenty of medium and even low severity vulnerabilities being targeted, and that becomes an issue. Everything suddenly feels important, and you have to react quickly. It's a little like going to the grocery store hungry. Everything is important, but it doesn't really belong in your cart. The goal is to focus on what really matters in your environment. Is the vulnerability actually exploitable? Is the affected device critical? What's the real impact if it's compromised? When you combine exploitability with business context, the picture becomes a little bit more clear. Instead of chasing thousands of alerts, you can focus your time and resources on only a handful of risks that are most likely to disrupt your business. And that's how to reduce the noise in your environment, improve your resilience, and stay ahead of threats that actually matter. So now let's talk about what this looks like in practice. Traditional patching is still largely a manual process for the most part. Someone identifies an issue, schedules a change, hopes nothing breaks, and then moves on to the next ticket. It's a lot of work, and it's always playing catch up, right? It's a little like mowing the lawn while the grass is still growing. You never really feel like you're caught up. And this is where absolute resilience for automation takes a different approach. Instead of relying on people to chase every issue, we automate the remediation process based on real risk. Those workflows can run whether the device is on the corporate network, at home, or halfway around the world. More importantly, we don't stop when the fix is deployed. We verify it actually worked. And that verification step is critical because pushing a fix isn't the same as solving the problem. We can make sure the endpoint is healthy, the security control is working, and the device is back in the state that you are expecting it. And the result is less work for IT, fewer surprises, and more importantly, a business that keeps running. Now let's put that into practice. The challenge isn't finding vulnerabilities, it's closing the gap between identifying them and actually fixing them before they become breaches. Manual workflows simply can't keep pace. This is where automation changes the equation. Resilience for automation continuously detects, prioritizes, and remediates the issues that matter most without waiting for any type of manual intervention. And the result is straightforward. The smaller attack surface is there, there's less downtime, and the confidence that you have that the fix has actually worked. That's cyber resilience in action, not simply finding problems, but closing the gaps before attackers can exploit them. So we've talked about finding the right risks and automating the response, but there's one more challenge. Even after you've deployed a security control, how do you know it stays working? The reality is that controls can get disabled. Applications can get tampered with, configurations drift, and protections oftentimes slowly erode over time. And that's what attackers are expecting. So this section is more about staying resilient, how absolute, where we believe security controls shouldn't simply be deployed once and forgotten. They should be continuously monitored and help recover when something goes wrong. Let's take a look at how that works. Now, security controls aren't valuable because you install them. They're valuable because they're still working when you need them, right? The reality is that controls drift, they get disabled by attackers or users and simply stop functioning over time. And most organizations don't really discover that until after something is broken or gone wrong. And that's where Absolute is different. We continuously monitor critical security controls, detect when they fail or drift out of compliance, and automatically restore them without user or IT intervention. And the result is simple. Your security stack stays healthy, your business stays protected, and your team spend less time chasing broken controls. That's what we mean by self-healing resilience. Protection that doesn't simply get deployed, it stays deployed. Now, the final piece is proving that your controls are actually working, right? Too often, compliance becomes a fire drill in many cases. Teams scramble to collect screenshots, generate reports, and prove controls were working at a single point in time. Application resilience changes that from absolute. By continuously monitoring and automatically restoring critical controls, you always know the current state, and you always have the evidence to prove it. The result is continuous compliance instead of periodic compliance. Less effort over time for your teams, faster audits, lower risk, and greater confidence that your environment is protected every day, not only just on audit day. All right. This is the part you actually came for, right? I'll be handing this off to John, who will show you both of these applications on real endpoints, both automated remediation, and when controls need healing themselves. Full disclosure here, this is a recording because watching a patch deploy in real time is about as thrilling as watching paint dry. And we like you too much to do that to you. So, John, I'll pass it off to you so you can demonstrate how we're helping keeping organizations resilient.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. Up until this point, we've talked about visibility, exposure, risk, and why maintaining endpoint health remains such a challenge for most organizations. What I'd like to do now is shift from the discussion to a live demonstration. I'm going to show two capabilities that work together to help organizations maintain their desired endpoint state. First, we'll look at resilience for automation, where we'll identify a device missing a critical Microsoft update and use an automated workflow to remediate it. Then we'll transition into application resilience and watch what happens when a critical security application is completely removed from an endpoint. In both cases, the focus isn't just taking action, it's verifying that the endpoint actually ends up where we expect it to be. Let's start in the absolute console. Here we're looking at a Windows endpoint that's currently missing a critically rated Microsoft update KB509-4126. Because that update is missing, the device is considered vulnerable and out of compliance. Now, for most organizations, finding missing patches isn't the difficult part. Vulnerability scanners and reporting tools do a great job of identifying gaps, but that's just noise. The challenge is reliably closing those gaps and proving the issue was actually resolved. That's exactly what we're going to do. Before I launch the workflow, one quick note. For the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to start the workflow manually so that we can watch the process unfold. In production, most customers would tie this to policy conditions and triggers so that the entire process happens automatically whenever the criteria are met. Let's take a look at the workflow itself. You can see this workflow is designed to assess the device, identify whether the required patch is missing, install the update to enforce the process, validate success, and if necessary, perform a reboot to complete remediation. For time purposes, I won't be executing the reboot portion today, but it is built directly into the workflow. The key takeaway is that we're not simply automating a task, we're automating the entire remediation outcome. Let's go ahead and launch it. Now let's select the endpoint to be targeted, and we'll save the workflow to be published. Here we can see the device being targeted by the workflow, and so the workflow first validates the current patch state. And when the initial scan is finished, it confirms that KB509-4126 is missing. And from there, it's going to begin the download phase for the required content. And once finished, it will start the installation process or the execution phase. One thing I always like to point out is the difference between simply orchestration and verification. Sending an installation command is relatively easy, but the real value comes from proving that the endpoint actually reached the desired state after the action is taken. And that's exactly what we're doing here. So we're going to give that a few minutes to finish. And rather than just trust a status message, we're going to hop back to the operating system. Now we're going to go ahead and open the Windows Update history and installed updates information. And we can see that KB509-4126 is present on the system. So we validated the entire process from end to end. The vulnerability was identified, the patch was deployed, and we've confirmed directly on the endpoint that the update is indeed installed. Now let's return to the console. Because the workflow includes validation steps, the endpoint has automatically been reassessed and the vulnerability has been remediated. The device is successfully returned to compliance. No separate ticket, no manual follow up, no secondary verification process. The workflow handled the full lifecycle and confirmed that the endpoint reached the desired state. Now, there's an important assumption behind everything that we just demonstrated. We're assuming the tools responsible for managing and protecting the endpoint are remaining healthy. Because even the most effective patching strategy depends on those security and management controls continuing to function correctly. And that's where application resilience comes in. Let's go ahead and take a look. Before we move to the endpoint, I do want to quickly show one thing. Here in the console, we can see that a CrowdStrike Falcon resilient application policy has already been created and it's already been activated. This is important because it means that remediation has already been defined ahead of time. Nothing needs to be manually triggered. No administrator will need to intervene once the application falls out of its expected state, and the policy is active and monitoring continuously. With that in place, let's now move to the endpoint. On this system, CrowdStrike Falcon is currently installed and operating normally. For today's demonstration, I'm going to intentionally remove it. One important note before I do that. This test is being performed with full local administrative privileges and CrowdStrike tamper protection currently disabled. The reason is simple. We want to visualize how application resilience responds when a critical application is recognized as completely missing. In a real world deployment, tamper protection would, of course, remain enabled and provide an additional layer of protection. But for demonstration purposes, we're intentionally creating the failure condition ourselves. So let's go ahead and let's uninstall CrowdStrike Falcon. Now we're going to go ahead and launch the uninstall process and completely remove the application. At this point, the endpoint has effectively lost one of its primary security controls. Normally, this is where a help desk ticket might be generated, an alert might be raised, and someone would need to investigate. Instead, we're simply going to observe what happens. What we're seeing now is application resilience detecting that the endpoint no longer matches the expected healthy state that is defined within the policy. Because that policy was pre-configured and activated ahead of time, remediation begins automatically. Nobody clicked a repair button, nobody initiated a reinstall, and no one remotely connected to the device. The platform recognized that the critical application was missing and immediately began to restore it to the approved state. Depending on the application and the failure condition, that action can involve also restarting services, restoring files, correcting configuration drift, or even performing, in this case, the full reinstall. In this example, because Falcon was completely removed, we're going to watch the application reinstall itself. A few moments ago, Falcon was uninstalled from this device. And now we can see the Falcon application and the associated components within the bundle returning to the endpoint. The endpoint has automatically recovered without administrator intervention and without requiring any action from the end user. That is the power of application resilience. It is not simply monitoring for failure, it automatically corrected it. Let's jump back to the slides and wrap things up. What we saw today were two very different scenarios. In the first, we had a vulnerable endpoint with a missing critical update. We kicked off an automated workflow, installed the patch, and then verified directly on the device that the update was actually there. In the second, we deliberately removed CrowdStrike Falcon from the endpoint and watched a pre-configured resilient application policy recognize the problem and restore the application without anybody stepping in. For me, the value here is pretty straightforward. Every IT and security team has more work than people. The challenge isn't finding things that really need attention. Most organizations already have plenty of dashboards, alerts, and reports telling them what's wrong. The challenge is making sure those issues actually get resolved and stay resolved. What you've seen today is one example of handling a missing patch and another example of handling a missing security tool. Different problems, same outcome. The endpoint gets brought back to where it should be, and your team does not have to stop what they're doing just to make that happen. And when you start applying that approach across hundreds or thousands of devices, that's where operational impact becomes real. So if there's one thing I'd really like to leave you with, it's this. Automation gets you back to the secure state. Resilience keeps you there.
Thanks, John. That was great. Seeing it on our screen is one thing, but seeing it on your own endpoint is the real test. So if any of this resonated with you, I encourage you to book a demo with us so you can drill into more questions or run a trial in your own environment, see how it operates in your own environment. There won't be any pressure, but I think that's a good next step. Okay. Let me leave you with four simple takeaways. First, You can't patch your way out of exposure. I already talked about that. You should focus on the risks that actually matter. Second, automate and verify. It's not enough to remediate. You'll need to know exactly the fix actually worked. Third, security controls have to stay healthy over time. Resilience means they detect, recover, and self heal automatically. And finally, resilience is measurable. The outcomes are tangible, less downtime, continuous compliance, and lower operational risk. And if there's one thing I'd like you to remember, it's really this. Cyber resilience isn't about deploying more security. It's about ensuring your security keeps working when your business depends on it. Okay, let's get to some questions that you all have had. The first one, I think, John, this one probably goes to you. Why does there seem to be more patches issued these days?
Okay. I think it's really a combination of complexity and speed. Modern environments have more dependencies now than ever. And as many of us know, in a post-Mythos world, AI is helping vendors and researchers alike identify and hopefully remediate those vulnerabilities faster than they ever have before. It's great for security, but it also means that organizations are evaluating and deploying those patches at much higher cadence than we were just even last year.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. I mean, as I said earlier in the call, this month's Patch Tuesday, 578 CVEs, the most we've ever had. So there's no stopping, and there's no stopping this in sight. The next question, probably to you, John, as well. How is it possible to manage patch windows when teams are spread geographically all throughout the world?
Excellent question, and we've seen this shift as well just within the last decade or so, even just the last few years. I think that a lot of organizations are moving away from schedules and managing patches purely based on geography and time zone, which it traditionally has been in the past. They're leaning more on deployment rings, starting with representative samples of users or business units, validating how those different kind of pockets, rather than being department based, it could be small samples of varying departments. And again, unrelated to the time zone. I've seen this shift quite a bit just in the past few years in speaking with customers. Then, of course, if it works, they expand from there and they move on to deployment ring to deployment ring. Time zones still do matter, maybe more around a reboot strategy, but not necessarily the patch phase itself. The bigger focus is, of course, reducing risk based on phased rollouts, ensuring that there's proper handle of productivity while still controlling the validation layer.
Great answer, John. Here's another interesting question, and probably a one that you can probably drill into a little bit more. But how is Absolute Security using AI within its products?
Yes, so another great question. At Absolute Security, we use AI as an intelligence and productivity layer within our content operations. It really helps our teams analyze and patch-related information more efficiently, improving validation workflows, that we have success rates that we're of course are set as our goals, and overall reducing supply chain risk, allowing our experts to focus more of their attention where it delivers the most value rather than just efficiency.
Yeah. And I will say that we are investigating more and more ways to use AI within the products and, not only within the products, but how our customers can use that going forward. Here's another question I think I'll take the swing at, but what's the link between compliance verification and cyber insurance costs? Well, we know that if you're more secure and have more controls in place and you're more compliant, we know cyber insurance premiums will be reduced. And we have customers that reported the fact that they can continuously demonstrate compliance, which means that they are able to minimize their cyber insurance premiums. So, of course, like anything, the cost of avoidance of having continuous compliance is significant. It means hardened endpoints, fewer incidences, and improved productivity and faster recovery. So there is definitely a link between compliance verification and ensuring that you can reduce your premiums going forward with a cyber insurance. Um, One more question here. I have already a patch management tool in place. How can I decide what's the best approach to improve resilience? We have found that organizations we speak to have a patching in place, right? They rarely have a complete solution. And by this, I mean a solution that manages all devices, all operating systems, and even third-party software. So adding a platform like Absolute means really patching can be automated for all use cases with added resilience and faster recovery. And we recognize that a rip and replace strategy just isn't feasible in many cases. And that's one of the aspects we've explored in our latest buyer's guide, the Patch Management Buyer's Guide, which is a guide to patch management strategy in the age of AI. And I encourage you to take a look at that. And we'll be sending you a link to this valuable guide following this session going forward. And hopefully you find that valuable. And then one final question that we have here is, do you offer a free trial? This is a great way to see the value of automated resilient patching. Our team can reach out to you to set this in motion if you're interested. And we've got many places on our website you can request more in-depth detail and even a free trial. So those are all the questions we had. Time for today. Thank you for participating and submitting your questions. I'll just say that this is a wrap. That's the one line I'll leave with you is that you can't patch your way out, but you can close that gap and even prove it in many cases. And if you'd like to see it on your own endpoints, like I said, hit the request button and we'll be happy to get in touch with you and show you how this will operate in your environment. So thanks for your time today, and I hope you have a great day.